Hello, everyone, and today we will be talking about the March on Washington, and specifically the rights movement and precisely the women's suffrage movement and how this movement was a turning point in history and provides rights for women such as the voting rights, the right to work, and to get paid at a higher salary. Many more changes were placed due to the March on Washington. Throughout this documentary, we will be discussing the issues that were faced before the march and the challenges faced by the women from the years of 1820 throughout the years of 1830, and the obstacles they overcame. In this documentary, we will also discuss the changes in which caused the turning point in the history of the women's rights movement and how everything changed since then. We will also compare and contrast the before and after the women's rights march.
In the 1970s, women were allowed to own their own property, and that was under effect after the women's suffrage movement, and was a turning point in history which allowed women to own their own properties and make more independent decisions on their own. According to research, now 57% of all real estate brokers and agents are females. 50% of property, real estate, and community association managers are women. 10.76 million U.S. houses are owned and occupied by a single woman. The women's suffrage movement and the March on Washington was a huge turning point in history which transferred women from not being allowed to own property without their husband to having a say in what their husband buys or sells to owning their own properties and becoming real estates.
The gender pay gap was not easily addressed and solved. Till this day, there are some countries like the USA, Canada, Finland, and France that have a wage gap of 15% and more. But it has definitely improved since the women's rights movement in Washington in 1848. Another challenge that was faced was that women were not allowed to own properties or own credits, and it all had to be under the name of their husbands or a male relative that could be in control of any property that associates to a woman. This gave women limited property rights. In 1771, New York passed an act to confirm certain conveyances and directing the manner of providing deeds to be recorded. This law required a married man to get his wife's signature on any deed to her property before he sold or transferred it to someone else. This also required a judge to meet with a wife to confirm her approval on selling or transferring the land of any property. 3 years later, Maryland decided to pass a similar law which required a judge to sit with the married woman and get her approval on any trade that concerned her husband.
To begin, we will talk about the challenges that were faced before the March on Washington, and one of the most known issues was that women were prohibited from voting and were found as no help to the Constitution. In 1868, the 14th Amendment defined citizens and voters in particular as male. Soon, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1890, the two organizations became the National American Women's Suffrage Association. By this time, the states of Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, and Washington had already allowed women to vote. In the past, before 1848, women's voting voices had no impact on voting, and in fact, they were not even allowed to vote because they were known as no use constitutionally, and their voice didn't matter. The 19th Amendment opened up voting for women, but not all women got the right to vote. It wasn't until 1920 that all women, regardless of their race, got the right to vote. Another obstacle faced by women was the gender pay gap that took place between the years 1950 and 1980. The gender pay gap was when women would get paid way less than men, even though the jobs they had were the same or at the same qualities or hours of work. This gender pay gap is related to sexism or gender discrimination because of this women faced barriers to success, and they felt as if they were less than a man or have more disabilities, and realized they have to put an end to this issue and change what was happening. Not only were women not getting paid, but they were also not getting the same job opportunities as a man, and were getting discriminated against what job they wanted to work based on their gender.
The women's suffrage movement produced the largest one-time increase in voters in America's history. It also led to the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. This allowed 22 million women to vote after years and years of suffering and protesting for their rights and voices to be heard. It provided equal access to education for both men and women, as well as allowing women to have a right to their own property and custody over their children. It also created better working conditions and created an international peace movement that only increased rallies and protests throughout the years. It also gave women the right to make individual decisions such as divorces or pregnancies. No taxation without representation was a huge slogan made in the women's suffrage movement. It spoke to the citizens that women are wage workers and pay their taxes, and their pay is not equal to men's. Women were not the only ones who benefited from this movement. Children, also from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, also received large gains from the suffrage movement. The women's suffrage movement has created an example of natural rights, and demanding that those rights should be recognized is not a crime.